Let's begin. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: king takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king takes rook. King takes pawn. King to e5. King to e3. d4 check. King to d3. King to f5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is king to d5. King to e3. King to e5. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. a4 check. King takes pawn. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Queen takes rook, check. Rook takes knight, check. Rook takes rook. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Rook takes knight, check. The puzzle is solved using: rook takes knight, check. Knight takes rook. Queen takes knight, check. Queen to d2. Queen takes rook, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to c7, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to b7, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to c7, check. Bishop takes rook. Rook to b7, check. King to a8. Rook takes bishop, check. Let's continue. Threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: king to c4. King to d2. h5. King to c1. King takes pawn. King to b1. King to d4. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is f4. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Queen to h4. Pawn takes knight. Let's continue. The threats are: rook takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king to e4. Knight to e1. Rook to d2, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: there are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to d8, check. Rook to e8, check. The answer is queen to d8, check. King to g7. Rook to e8. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes knight, check. The checks are: queen to e6, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen to h5, check. Queen to d5, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes bishop, check. King to g6. f3. Rook to e8. Queen to b4. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Checks in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: knight takes knight. Bishop takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to e4, checkmate. Knight to h1, checkmate. Bishop takes rook, check. Bishop to h3, checkmate. Bishop to h1, checkmate. Bishop to f1, checkmate. Queen to g1, check. Rook to d2, check. Rook to e2, checkmate. Rook to f1, check. Answer to this puzzle is: bishop to h1, checkmate. Next, here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to h6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. a7. Rook to a2. Rook to h6, check. King to g5. Rook to a6. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are: rook to e8, check. Rook to b7, check. f6, check. The best move in puzzle position is f6, check. King to f7. Rook to b7, check. Next puzzle, threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is c6. Rook to h7. Rook to c1. Rook to c7. Rook to b1. Bishop to f2. Rook to b7. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Knight to d2, check. Knight to a3, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes rook, check. Next puzzle, the threats are. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes bishop. The checks are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e3, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Queen to c5. King to h1. Queen takes queen. Let's continue. The threats are. Rook takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to c1, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Knight to f4. Knight takes queen. Knight takes rook, check. King to f1. Knight takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to g5, check. Bishop to d2, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Queen to g5, check. King to b1. Bishop to g4. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to e2, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Rook takes pawn. Bishop to e5, check. King to h7. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Next, threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. Knight to e2, check. The answer is. King to e2. Bishop to d4. Knight to d3, check. King to g3. Knight takes pawn. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to b6, check. Knight to c7, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to e3, check. Knight to c3, check. Knight to b4, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Knight takes pawn, check. King to h8. Queen takes knight. Queen to a5, check. Queen takes queen. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to g3, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to c1, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Rook takes pawn, check. King to g1. Bishop to c5, check. Another one, here are threats in puzzle position. King takes pawn. King takes bishop. Here are checks in puzzle position. Promotes to queen, check. Promotes to rook, check. Rook to g2, check. Rook to c1, check. Solution to the puzzle is. King takes bishop. d7. King to e7. Rook to b8. King takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. The checks are. Rook to c8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to a8. Rook to a3. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.